All right. So all these notes here you can kind of look at in a second. Basically, what I want to talk to you guys about is that a couple things. Number one, all living things produce from their parent or the original cell. That cells have to come from other cells. A living thing must be able to have origins in another living thing. We get that once again from an old topic, the original cell theory. Okay. The reason why offspring look and act like the parent is because traits or genes are passed down from generation to generation. It's no shocker that you have characteristics of both your mom and your dad. And our genetic material is also housed in each individual cell. It's not housed in another organ, in the brain, or something like that. Every cell has its own DNA. And that's why if you commit a crime or do anything like that, you leave behind one hair, one sample of DNA, you can get caught. Okay? Another concept that was from the original cell theory. So there are two types of cell division we're going to talk about. 7.1 is all about mitosis. 7.2 is all about meiosis. Now these two processes are similar, but they're also very different. So if there was an essay question on this next test, which I'm not sure there's going to be, but if there was, a great essay question would be to compare and contrast mitosis to meiosis. Now, mitosis, a basic definition that you need to know, it's a process that produces two daughter cells that are identical. So mitosis, you got to think about being identical. Okay, so mitosis, you get two, and they're identical to each other. Whereas meiosis, you'll see down here, they get four daughter cells, and they're very different from each other. So anytime we want two cells that are be the same, we use mitosis. When we get different cells, we use meiosis. This is great for doing skin or hair or liver or heart.
Matt Harris.
Meiosis is really good for only producing sperm and egg. All right, so that's what the chapter is about, but a little backtrack. People originally thought things could come from non-living things. Well, you think about that, like how dumb could you be? But realistically, you see dead meat, all of a sudden there's maggots on it. Where'd the maggots come from? We didn't see anything come there. They must have came from spontaneous. Spontaneous means from nothing or without any energy. We talked about that. Generation is life. So life would come from non-living things. And the two best evidence of that were eels from slime and meat from dead flies. This theory goes all the way back to the days of Aristotle. He had this idea of spontaneous generation, but he called it abiogenesis. If you break that word, a refers to not, bio means living, and genesis means origin or beginning. Okay, so he believed in a not biological beginning, and that's how he thought life existed. Today, I hope every one of you, Mandolfo, understand that living things have to come from living things. They don't come from a rock or from mud or anything like that. They have to come from another living thing. Okay, but it wasn't proven until 1859. So think about that. From Aristotle all the way to 1859, this concept of abiogenesis was still around. The researcher that actually developed this theory is actually pretty interesting, and so we're going to look at that real quick. So the first guy is a Italian by the name of Francisco Loretti, and what he did is he performed this experiment, and it was simple, it was well thought out, and his idea was to disprove spontaneous generation. So he was like, hey guys, this isn't hard. There's eggs being laid in the meat. That's where it's coming from. So what he did was he just simply took some meat, okay, and he put one of them in a jar that was closed, and the other one was in like a netting where flies could get to. And what it showed was that in the jar the top had like a screen on it, so air could get in, but flies could not. Here the meat was just exposed, so air and flies could get in. This one had maggots, okay, had eggs and baby flies. This one did not. Pretty simple, self-explanatory experiment. So, he placed, as it says here, meat in the 2 jars, covered one with so air could get through, flies couldn't, left the other one open. Maggots were only found in the open meat. Okay? Okay, now, you think that would completely disprove spontaneous generation. It did not. There was these people who believed that there was something else going on that caused the flies to appear, not to appear, had something to do with the air. So we'll talk about 1668, okay, but there's more to it. Here's just a picture of the experiment done by Reddy. Once again, this was not my drawing diagram, but I wish it was because it's a lot better than anything I could do. And these are the 2 containers. This one allowed air in, okay, but not the flies. This one, no flies or air, and this one was open to the environment. It's a good controlled experiment, and it shows spontaneous generation is not possible with flies. But it's actually ironic that another experiment kind of changes this. 1675, they discover microorganisms, bacteria, protozoa, things like that. Remember back to a couple chapters ago, a guy by the name of Anton van Leeuwenhoek. He makes this simple microscope, says, hey, look at all this protists. So, what happens? The people who are believing in spontaneous generation go, whoa, 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 whoa. Aha. Where do those microorganisms come from? They must come from spontaneous generation. So, a discovery of microorganisms actually reopens this debate, and the debate continues for 200 years. Francisco Redi thought he'd disprove it. He did for flies. People are like, okay, we got it with flies, but what about bacteria? Well, let's find out about bacteria. So, there's a guy by the name of Louis Pasteur. And Louis Pasteur, this guy right here, he was French. Don't hold that against him. And he devised an experiment to disprove spontaneous generation for microorganisms. Okay, he was there, and he's one of those guys that was like, hey, there's no way that microorganisms come from nothing. They must come from other organisms. People in the time believed in this infusion. Infusion's kind of this, I don't know how to describe it. It would be similar to the Midichlorians, whatever things in Star Wars, that like they're just randomly in the air and in living things, and they brought things to life. And that's what's causing the species to come from nothing, was these infusions in the air. So he said, well, no, microorganisms come from spores, and I'll prove it. And he designed a really cool experiment. One of the things I want you to either know, you should know already, is what is Pasteur most famous for? So this was a big experiment, but there's something else that affects our daily lives that Pasteur's famous for. I want you to look that up, if you don't know already, and write that down in your notes as well. Could be on a quiz. So, how did he test this? What he did is he said, well, the problem is simply this. How do we expose our research to the infusions in the air, these magical powers in the air, which he didn't believe existed, but not let the spores infuse? So what he did was a very ingenious solution. He created a new equipment, and he boiled the infusion, killing off any organisms, and then exposed it to the air that was free of spores. So that way there's still air, the infusion would still be there, but there's no spores, so you should not get any life. And what he did was, he made a setup that kind of looked like this. He had a little container, and then it went like this, a real weird design on this tube. And in here he put a liquid and all the natural resources that the bacteria would like. So he put some sugar in there, some water, all that kind of stuff. And then he boiled it, making sure there's no bacteria in here. Turn off the heat. And what happened is, you notice, air could get through this container. The air would be able to flow through and get to here. And therefore, if there is infusion in the water, we should get bacteria growth. But what happens are spores and bacteria do not have any ability to fly or move around. They just kind of float. So they'd float down to this point right down here and just collect. They couldn't go back up in this tube here in an infusion. Therefore, there was nothing growing in here. And that's exactly what Pasteur thought. So now all of a sudden, he proves it right. He says, look, there's nothing growing in here. But people say, it's because the infusion wasn't allowed to get in, or you killed off the materials in here that allowed infusions. He also had a simple solution for that as well. So here's his experiment, just as I explained it. He boiled it, okay? That's the first thing he did, killing off anything. Microorganisms were trapped because they couldn't get through, but air could get through. Now, they said, well, what happens to the you killed off everything in here to allow life. So what he did was he tilted it. Tilting it allowed the spores to get in there. We see microorganisms happening to form in there. So it's a very simple experiment to test the spontaneous origin hypothesis. Okay? And there it is. He created the equipment and everything. So, Aristotle had the theory of abiogenesis, and Pasteur led to the idea of biogenesis, meaning that every living thing, bio means living, genesis means origin or beginning, has a biological origin or genesis. Now, this is going to be important because we're going to look at this later in the third quarter. But right now, under present time and under present conditions, so once again, currently this theory holds still. We're going to look at this in the third quarter because under present conditions is the key term. If life started on our planet spontaneously under maybe different conditions and at a different time, it may have been possible. But right now, under the theory of abiogenesis, it is not. Okay? And once again, if you think about this concept, the theory of biogenesis, it ties into what we talked about 2 chapters ago with the original cell theory. Okay? All life had to come from other living things, and that life can't start spontaneously. That's the end of this video. The next one is going to look at the stages of mitosis. Thank you very much.